Welcome, everyone, and hello. We're rounding out our summer days here with another special issue in this year's webinar series, as today is hosted with the American Bar Association. Thank you for tuning in, as there will be a contextual discussion and live demonstration of the functionality of the newly launched Restorative Justice Laws Database. So we invite you to visit mcorj.org/laws or scan the QR code you see on your screen, as it should bring you to the database website to follow along, check out some of the features during our time together. And also don't forget to utilize the Q&A feature, as always, during our webinars, during the conversation for any questions you may have. My name is Avery Arrington. I use she and her pronouns. I'm one of the assistant directors at the National Center on Restorative Justice. And at this time, I want to thank our grant host institution and additional partners at Vermont Law and Graduate School, the University of San Diego, the University of Vermont, as well as our federal funding partners at the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We're grateful for your support and continuous collaboration. I'll now turn things over to our presenters today, Talia Gonzalez and Dr. Lindsay Pointer. And a special shout out and thank you to Dr. Shannon Sleva, who was a key collaborator in the creation of the database but couldn't be here today, as well as two Vermont Law and graduate students who worked on the data collection, Karen Shu and Anna Van Roy. Talia, Lindsay, and the rest of the team have put a lot of work and thoughtfulness into this project, and we thank you for taking the time today to roll it out for us. I'll now pass things over to you, Talia.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, it's delightful that everyone's here. Unfortunately, I can't see you, right? Usually we say it's wonderful to see each other in this context. And for those of you that will be viewing this after the fact, it's fantastic that you found that there's potentially value in this work and really having a free and accessible tool. So my welcome is very short, right? My welcome is to the extent that I am delighted to co-host this as co-chair of the Diversion and Restorative Justice Committee that the ABA Criminal Justice Section has created and has done a series of webinars previously, but really is thinking about what is free and accessible public information, especially in the context of law. So I come to you in that context for the welcome, but then I actually pivot to the context of being a presenter, right? The uniqueness sometimes of how we wear the multiplicity of hats that we do. And I want to turn to thinking about the intention and aim of the database, right? And in particular, I've used these words now a couple of times, but I want to underscore them. The creation of this database was to ensure that there was free and that there was public access to laws, and that it's broadly available for a whole host of stakeholders, so that no one is put in a position that they're trying to learn about how their government is functioning or the ways in which laws are deeply impacting individuals' lives by operating through a paywall, for example, like a Lexis or Nexus if you happen to work in the legal field. Or, right, having to go into your state legislation and online. So one, a presumption of access online, but then secondarily, right, that the navigation of what that is quite simple. I'll say that someone who I think I do have expertise in research, I don't enjoy going state by state and looking at their individual state legislative websites and trying to ascertain what the laws are. And so that was the point here, is how do we create a consolidated space in which, and we will do a demonstration to really underscore and illustrate this, to be able to provide this type of information about what we are calling, right, and what the database is called restorative justice laws. And in a second, I'll turn it over to Lindsay to help us think about sort of what is that terminology, right, and why are we using that terminology, and what does this capture? Three other things that I want to point out in terms of intention and aim before we pivot to scope is that currently this database is updated as of June 1st of this year. So this is not going to be a daily real-time updating. So just having a sensibility that our intention, right, is to create a yearly snapshot that's cumulative over a period of time, but certainly isn't something that if you want to know on September 15th one year and you want to know on October 12th the next year and January 2nd, that's going to be what's available. So there may be something missing, right, if it's not at the annual mark, which our intention is to actually start to calibrate that with legislative cycles as what it looks like. The second point is that right now it's 374 laws, right? And we're using the term law broadly because, as you'll see when we look at it, right, that includes a host of different formulations. So it might not just be a codified statute, right? It could be in the context of an administrative rule, but something that is about that formal process. So there's not an informality to what's included in this. And that also is part of our aim, is to really think in that sort of formal legal way. And then, as I said, right, and I'll reiterate, which is my third point, which is that this is about an annual update, so that when people are using it, right, and the intention and aim is that that annual update would be available, and that this as data, right, as a larger data set of what these laws are, presents the national, right, so intention, a national landscape and a local landscape, and then disaggregated in these unique and different ways so that it truly is accessible to all stakeholders. With that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Yeah, so for the majority of our time today, we're going to really dive into showing you the database and, like Talia said, showing some of the functions. But before we do that, just to add a little bit around the scope of what this database contains and also what it doesn't do for you, right? So first of all, when I screen share in a moment, you'll see one of the kind of search criteria is form of practice, and that has different terms that we're familiar with in the restorative justice field. It has restorative justice, restorative practice, it has circle practice, impact panel, victim offender. Those are the terms and the form of practice that were used in searching for the laws that are ultimately included in this database. Now, of course, we know that there's a lot of different opinions in terms of definition of restorative justice and what should count as restorative justice. And we didn't do a lot of that work of discerning, should this particular form of practice be considered restorative justice? And so we've been pretty broadly inclusive. And we came to that decision based on conversations with folks working in the restorative justice field, starting with the term restorative justice and then expanding out from there. What other terms should we be searching for and forms of practice should we be including in order to try to capture all of the laws that are relevant to restorative justice implementation across the states. And so just to flag that, and as you go through, you may see things that you don't consider fully restorative, or you might be exposed to different forms of practice as you're moving through. So what this will do is it will show you the laws, it will show you an excerpt of the relevant text, it will link you to where you can see the full text when that is available. But it won't interpret them for you. It won't do a lot of that interpretation work. We're going to be working on building out this resource to link to some of the research by Talia and Shannon and others who do some of that more interpretation work. It also won't tell you about what's actually happening on the ground. So what are the programs and practices that exist on the ground? It's really just providing the laws, and so that you can see what those laws are in each state. We do have, with the National Center on Restorative Justice, we have a collaboration with the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, NACRJ, to host a map of restorative justice programs around the country that's available on the NACRJ website. We can include a link to that resource. So if you were looking for something more like, what are the programs in my state, or understanding some more of that on the ground practice, that's a good starting point. It obviously doesn't include everything yet, but we're working to populate it. But this is really about the laws. This resource is about the laws. And then just to reiterate what Talia said, this isn't real time. We are going to update it once per year. And so anything that happens between those updates won't be reflected. It also doesn't include proposed legislation. It's that once a year update. And as you're using this resource, which we're very excited for more people to begin using it, if you see something that's missing, please be in touch. We are committed to making updates. I already heard from someone that was involved in one of the laws in Oregon who said, oh, this legal feature is really relevant and hasn't been tagged as connected to this law yet. And so we're able to make minor changes and corrections like that. We want to know if we've missed something. So thank you for helping us out in that way if you find something that you see missing. So that's a note on scope. Any other framing sort of information, Talia, we can jump into the demonstration?
No, I think that's great, because you'll remind folks at the end, there's actually going to be a second webinar that picks up on larger questions of restorative justice legislation and policy that will really dive into perhaps some of the things that come up when we start to think about this as codified into formal law across different dimensions. So, yeah.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to go ahead and screen share for us. So what we wanted to do, we were trying to think of an interesting and engaging way to demonstrate some of the functions of this database. So what we're going to do for this portion of our webinar is I am going to pose a series of kind of hypotheticals to Talia. So imagining that I'm different types of people working in the restorative justice field with different needs out of this database. And then Talia is going to instruct me, and I will show you so that you can follow along how one would use the database to respond to those various needs. After we go through a few of these examples, we will be using the Q&A function. If you have specific needs ways that you would like to be able to use this database resource, you can pose your question, and then Talia will walk you through in the same way so that we can show you how you would be able to use this resource. We'll also, of course, be open to answering more general or broad questions during that time as well. So just taking a moment to find that Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. So Talia, as you know, I'm in Colorado. I live in Colorado. So for this first hypothetical, I'm a restorative justice practitioner who just wants to understand what is the landscape of restorative justice laws in my state.
Sure. So what everybody's seeing here on Lindsay's screen as she's sharing is the entry page to it. And I'll actually hold on before you scroll down, Lindsay. I want to point out that the reason the map is here is the map populates in a way as you're responding to see in the different jurisdictions. And by jurisdictions, I'm using the inclusive of states and the District of Columbia. So just so you have an idea as to why we're having a mapping element that exists as well when we start to populate. So you've entered into this, you've scrolled down a little bit because I can't see it, where I need to tell you perhaps some things that you might want to put in as to your query. There you go. So Lindsay just asked the question, I want to think about this from a state level, right? So let's sort of parse out the call to the question. So she wants to think about this from the state level, and she wants to understand sort of a broad landscape. So she's not interested in a national analysis. So the fastest and sort of easiest way to go in would be for Lindsay to just click on Colorado. Now you can see it is already subpopulated with 49 numerically next to it, because that's a signal that there are 49 laws that have been coded across the different practice areas, meaning sort of sites within the context of system relative to law, the child welfare, the criminal legal, right, and the education system. So this would give Lindsay or whomever in Colorado says, I want the big picture. I've got 40, so you could descriptively say, well, now there's 49 laws, and then you could scroll down, right, and see headers for each of those. So you would see, well, what is the header that's specific to the text that was included in also the law itself? So these headers have not been rewritten by anybody, so we're not extrapolating what those headers are supposed to be or what it's supposed to cover. And then if you click on one, whichever one you'd like to click on, Lindsay, because you say, oh, I'm interested in that, you'll actually now be able to look at what is the statute citation. For those of us that do those wonderful things called blue booking and citing, you can have the statute citation. You'll see that the relevant text is excerpted there, and then you can click further, right, to view the full text of the law itself. And so then as Lindsay scrolls down, right, so you now then can start to see the entire law itself. And if you scroll up quickly, Lindsay, to the middle, you'll see also where does it live within the code, right? So is this adjacent to other things of interest as people ultimately are thinking about working with it? And then you can click on that subsection with here in Fine Law, which is section 22-32-144-3. Oh, well, this is Lindsay's computer. It will bring you to Westlaw.
Yeah,
it would bring you to then ultimately the code itself. But with that, you could step back, right, and say, oh, I'm interested in this, and do a deeper dive in Colorado, or go back through and either be scrolling. So that's sort of high level, and you can do that for any jurisdiction. So if you hit reset filter, you could perform the same process to say Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, California, etc., and you can see numerically, and it would go through that. Hit me with another question, Lindsay.
Perfect. Yes. And then I was just also going to mention, you can also search by state by clicking on the map. Just another fun way to do that. Okay, so resetting our filter. Next hypothetical here, I'm interested in restorative justice for juveniles specifically, and I want to see some examples.
Sure. And so this is actually a great question because we didn't code by population in terms of reading the laws and doing that subcategorization. And I actually want to explain why. Because not every law in every single jurisdiction is written by population. So we would have created an artificial grouping of things that apply to juvenile by the single use of the term juvenile in it. And that wasn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to be as inclusive so that if it was a word youth, and that was actually what you're more interested in, or student, and you're more interested in that, or juvenile, as juveniles being used more often in the context of the criminal legal system. But to your question, you want to see some examples, and you've given me the term juvenile, you would put it in the search term box. And this is going to search the entire database, so all 374, for where there is a use of the word juvenile across those 374 laws. And then it's going to populate the text below, so you see that. And then if you go back up, Lindsay, you'll see that it also starts to help you subpopulate. So what it indicates for you is that in Alabama, there's 0 hits relative to that specific word of juvenile, Alaska 1, California 4, etc. You could then be slicing and dicing that to say, oh, I want to think about this with admissibility or data collection or fees or funding. Maybe I want to look at it as sub-practice, and each of those of the 94, the bigger picture number is going to bring you down into a smaller bracketing. And that's obviously true both for form of law and for practice, form of practice as well.
Right. Now reset our filter. So for this next one, I am a restorative justice practitioner, and I'm really worried about confidentiality in restorative justice processes. I'm looking for examples of laws related specifically to confidentiality.
Well, me too, Lindsay. And I can say that because I've written about this issue. So that's not a hidden sort of thing. It's in the public domain. And so it was actually something that when we, as an internal team, met and actually got external feedback, because we had a series of meetings to gather external feedback, and even thinking about this database and remembering that this database is not its own new inception. It's actually an outgrowth of what was initially work that was done at Georgia State and then ultimately was housed at DU and then now has become this. So those elements and those conversations and people's attention to it have been on it for a longer period of time than just, you know, a smaller internal team with the National Center, for example, coming together. And so we included this in 2 different ways, because you can think about this architecturally in law, both in terms of admissibility and in terms of the direct term of confidentiality. So you'll see here under legal feature that there you could click on either admissibility or confidentiality. There's a subpopulation of each of those in 10. This will bring you the universe across all of the states, or excuse me, all of the jurisdictions, right, where we see a word confidentiality or confidential, right, sort of the bifurcation of the American language, picking up that as a term of art. So then, of course, you would decide, oh, maybe I want to know a little bit more about it. What this isn't going to tell you is what type, right, of protection this is, if there is confidentiality and admissibility restrictions, but it'll get you right to the text so that you can then look for yourself about what it's inclusive of. I will say again, as someone who does significant research in laws, 10 is a really great number to work with, as opposed to 600, for example, or even 374. So again, our aim, right, is to really be of service as a tool.
Okay, resetting again. Last hypothetical from me, and then we can turn to ones from the Q&A or other questions. So I work as a restorative justice coordinator in a school in California. I'm interested to learn more about education laws in my state and more broadly.
Yeah, so you've now sliced it by 2 different ways at a state level. So you can see California has 35, so you can click on that. And then that's going to help you think about education, which there's 14 of those, so click on that. And then it's going to bring up those results. So we've gone from a larger category, meaning the state, to a smaller category, meaning as it exists in education. And so that allows you from the state level, right, to think about this, which is kind of the first part of the call of your question. As you said, I'm in California and I'm interested relative to this. But I think you also said about like more broadly or some of that language that was more at a national landscape. So then you can reset the filter and just think by area, right? And you could just choose education, right? So that's a bigger number, right? The difference between 14 and 105 is, I would say, significant. And so to the extent, right? So then maybe this is a place where you're sort of doing more of a larger national analysis. You're trying to get a sensibility, what states, where, et cetera. You can also, without clicking on any of the states, go to the state and use the little tab along the side to kind of get a quick glance. Oh, okay, I see California, Colorado, Connecticut, DC, so that could also signal for you, maybe I want to look a little bit deeper in some of these jurisdictions as well. Certainly, again, as we did in the very first instance, we have a subpopulation by title that you can click on below in the 105 results. So you see the first one there with Washington, school absence elimination, but that would continue as well. So that's another way to kind of get into the information. Again, it's a tool of information, and it's not going to interpret for you what it looks like in a school. So and I say that meaning that the presence of it in law does not guarantee that it's in your particular school or in your particular district. It does not necessarily define the ways in which practice exists. It might be a more generalized statement. It might be permissive. It might be mandatory. It might be related to exclusionary school discipline. It might not be related to exclusionary school discipline. So that work of kind of understanding, right, where it exists and how it exists is not something that this is going to provide. And we actually think that that's really important, because to have an individual or smaller set of individuals doing that interpretive work in a public space and in a public tool like this really leads to that there could be some bias selection in that. And we really wanted to avoid that. We really wanted people to be able to use this in that way. Certainly with education and schools in particular might lead to some interest in the type of practice. And so then you could look to see if there's an intersection in the law. It's specifically of, is it naming a form of practice, that final category as well. So with that, I see that there's 10 things popping up in the Q&A. I haven't looked at them at all, so I'm not ignoring anyone intentionally or willfully. So I'm also happy to jump into those in that context.
We do have some questions. I know everyone can hear me, right? Great. Okay. So the first question we have is, can folks submit requests for consideration to include in the yearly update?
So I think that's a Lindsay question. Yeah, absolutely. So related to my note before around, if you see something missing, like, hey, why wasn't this legal feature tagged for this particular law? Also, if you feel like we missed a law that really should be included, we'd be interested to know, like, if it has terms that aren't in this form of practice list or something like that, like why it didn't pop up before. So please reach out to me, because that's definitely information we're looking to gather.
And I will say, to respond to you, Debbie, right? So the coding was done by a team, and so it meant there was not a single verification; it was double verification in terms of what the terms were used, and again, terms that were coming out of not just what had been published in the prior databases, but what had then overlapped with a large research review of terminology, but then also what overlaid based on how people were reflecting on what should or shouldn't be included. There is probably going to be something, to Lindsay's earlier point, where someone thinks it should or shouldn't be included. And so I just want to acknowledge, right, that like maybe a new term will come up, maybe a new term that would be included, maybe a new term won't. But I think it's really important, right, to know that the validity relative to searching the laws themselves, I think we feel fairly confident, right, based on all of the different coded contexts, that we didn't inadvertently miss something. Now, errors are always possible, but having that double validation was really important to us.
Wonderful. There's a couple of questions regarding restorative justice models in tribal jurisdictions. Is this something that will eventually become available? Was there thought to include that data as well?
Hey, Grace, how are you? Nice to hear you. I can't see you, right? I'll hear you through your words. So we did include the word peacemaking, as you'll see, in form of practice as a first intervention in trying to conceptualize what it means to code outside of the state or the jurisdictional, meaning the District of Columbia level. So I think the answer is yes. I think there's an openness to that. I think that it just didn't happen in first phase, right? And it would be a good feature, and then just need to be additive in understanding what is the database inclusive of relative to both tribal governments and tribal codes, but then state level infrastructure and the District of Columbia. Like there's no county level things in here, for example, too. So like if a county board of supervisors has issued a statement that restorative justice should be included in schools, like that's not formal law and it's not going to be included in this. And I don't use that to make a comparison between tribal governments and sovereignty, right, as nations and the idea of county governments, but just so people get a sensibility of like that macro level was not included either.
Okay, we're rolling along. I'm jumping around. Can you say more, Madison said, can you say more about how the forms of practice were defined? I'm surprised to see only one hit for restorative circles. So can we talk more about how were the forms of practice defined?
Sure. Lindsay, I feel like I'm just jumping in. So if you want to, I'm happy to.
No, that's great. Real quick, Avery, are there questions around like how to search for certain things, or should I end screen share just so that
you can probably end screen share.
we can always restart it if we need to?
Well, you may
Yes.
want to answer this question, or I can answer this question while screen sharing.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
let's
go
see
for
form
it.
of practice. Yeah.
So the forms of practice were decided upon based on the earlier databases and what was coded, work that I have done, work that Shannon has done as people that sort of lead in the field of coding around restorative justice. We then took feedback, the laws, right? We then took feedback from 3 different working groups that had attention to thinking about what should the initial coding terms be, as well as I said, doing the literature review to say what are the common terms of practice and descriptively. And then we took those narrow terms and overlaid those against the laws. So that was the selection criteria for that.
Fantastic. There's a question about anything comparable in Canada. Is there anything, I'm assuming the question is there anything like this in Canada? And if, Marsh, if you are still on here, you can elaborate if you would like. Any questions about Canada is not included in this database, correct? Because this is only
No, we do. This is not this is not a North American database. So really appreciate that question mark, that question mark. And I actually think the best person, so to my knowledge, there is not a database of complementarity for Canada, but the best person to direct that question to, if there is something internal, would be Professor Jennifer Llewellyn at Dalhousie. And we can put Professor Llewellyn's information in this in the chat. She runs the Restorative Justice Lab out of the law school there, and obviously as a very significant and amazing practitioner, as well as researcher and teacher in the field of restorative justice, I think would have a much better answer relative to the larger North American, if you will. But don't give us more work, please.
Okay, I'm still working along. There was another question. Will there be an expansion to policy used by various departments, such as the Department of Ed, Department of Corrections, Department of Human and Health Services, I believe, DHHS?
That's so I'm going to let Lindsay answer that, because to me that's a question of resources, right? One, in terms of trying to locate those, because they're not always publicly available, then be able to code those in terms of we think about inclusion, and then making a determination of whether they are binding policies in the same way that law is.
Yeah, so it's always a question of capacity and kind of priorities, right? As I think Talia mentioned earlier, we've been thinking about this project in phases, and we at this point have been thinking about the next phase as adding a little bit more kind of interpretation information. So we have a webinar coming up in November that will give a little bit more of that kind of analysis of restorative justice laws, resources on how to think about what makes good restorative justice laws, and just kind of building out some of that deeper dive as the next phase, while still making some adjustments to this database. But because of those difficulties that Talia mentioned, that isn't something that we have in the immediate future plan for expanding what's contained in this database. But this is iterative, it's emergent, and so we are, of course, curious to hear the feedback, hear about what would be most helpful to folks using this, how you're using it to inform our additional phases as we move forward in this process.
Okay, ready for more? Pedro, hello, says, not sure if they're asking this correctly, but how do we disambiguate ADR policies from laws and the database? Are there resources for alternative dispute resolution?
So we didn't code anything that used the terminology alternative dispute resolution. And we have not, sorry, and then I saw you had a second question there. I'm sorry, Pedro, which is we have not created any resources of a complementary nature for the ADR field or even the mediation field as well, right? Each of those as both parallel but distinct subfields to restorative justice, and parallel and distinct subfields to each other are governed by a whole set of ways and infrastructure, and that wasn't included here.
Thank you. And then can we mention I think I can answer this one, the one question I can answer. Can you speak about the resource we mentioned earlier, how one can find out what state program systems exist that include RJ practices? Yes, if you go to our website or NACRJ's website, but ncorj.org/map, our collaboration with NACRJ the map will appear. So I can actually type that in our chat box. And there are more, folks have great questions.
Let me just add one thing quickly.
Yeah,
on
please.
that map of programs. So for that map, it's being populated by submissions from programs and other provider groups. So if you see something that's missing on that map, know that we would love to hear from you, or encourage the program that to add themselves to the map, because unlike this database, which we went through a search process to populate it ourselves, that one is being populated by submissions from the field to be featured on the map. You can read more about that process on the NACRJ website as well.
And if you click on the answered questions, I also put the link in there as well for those that want to see the map directory. So if you toggle from open to answered, that should be public to be able to see the answer for the directory.
I'm scrolling through. I think we've answered all questions. I believe most of them are included. Someone asked about incorporating this in the Caribbean. Yes, it's specific to the US. Yes, I think that's it. I think we're good. Okay. Anything else? Lindsay, yes.
Going through too. So Mark, you had a second question about site in terms of jail, prison, corrections. There certainly are laws that speak to that. And so, but we did not create its own filter feature relative to as the single filter feature as a site of context. So like it would be included in the criminal legal. So you would want to use, right, the search box to say, put in prison, probation, community corrections, whatever your term is of art. And then my recommendation would then be to search, to then click on, I don't have it in front of me, so I'm trying to like mentally do this as a choose your own adventure, right? So you type into the search box those term of art, and then ultimately you're able to click within the criminal legal system to then see the below list to then search even further. At this time, you can't do, for those of you that might use Boolean searches, where you can put in like jail within 3 of juvenile, right? I'm using a bifurcation or a riff on Mark's question. So you can only do that single search term initially, though I think future iterations will hopefully include the ability to search across a multiplicity of terms. So even if it's just with an and or an as opposed to within a certain paragraph or sentence or other, that makes it much more complicated, and I'll be very candid, much more expensive to actually have the back end to do that. So I'm just trying to scroll through. I think there's a question more generally to people about indicating someone works in an RJ prison program and perhaps wanting to know if this is available in other states. So this database is only going to tell you if under law, there is a law relative to the use of, to use your term, restorative justice in the context of incarceration, not a programmatic answer, but it might be that the map that is done in collaboration with the National Center on Restorative Justice and NACRJ, the National Association of Community Restorative Justice, that a program could be done. And then, yeah, I think the same question about Washington, if you click on the link on the NACRJ page, which I'm more familiar with, you can actually then submit to be included. Information about practitioners, again, I would direct folks to there. Oh, cool. And you know Jennifer. Great.
I'm seeing a question similar to the question about a similar resource for Canada, about the same sort of question for New Zealand, if there's a database of laws. I am not aware of one, but similar to the recommendation to reach out to Jennifer, there's a great Center for Restorative Justice at Victoria University in Wellington that's led by Professor Jane Bolitho. So you could reach out to her, and she would know the answer to your question. So I can share a link to that in the Q&A as well.
There was a question here about faith-based restorative justice program. It is not to my knowledge that any of the laws will provide that as terms that are included. So I think that's probably better answered relative to the larger mapping project of programs and practitioners. So I'll just point that way. Susan's question, we don't have a federal infrastructure for restorative justice laws in the same way that, say, our neighbors to the north, to use Canada as the example, does. So we are not including that because it's not available. Happy to talk offline about that if you'd like. I will give a plug, not just for the map, but Lindsay and I serve as co-editors for the North American volume of the International Encyclopedia of Restorative Justice, which does have editorial volumes across the world. There's not going to be a database in the same way that this has been created for each one of those regions across the world, but that volume will ultimately be inclusive of examples of laws, architectures of laws, delineation. So in the US, obviously with states, it's not true everywhere in the world in terms of how government is set up, both from a federal or a non-federal standpoint or from dual federalism. But when that resource comes out, it'll give more texture and there will be examples there. So for those of you too that are thinking across, I mean, the transnational understandings of laws, either comparatively to like think about how they operate or what's happening, or even just the text of them, is a real deficiency in the field, right? It's something that I pay attention to. It's something that I work on. As I know, I have counterparts across the world that does that. So if there's others here that are interested, please do feel free to reach out to me. I am publicly easy to find. I work at a public university. Send me a note, if that is an area separate from this that you're really thinking about transnationally, which I think is an important conversation for us here in the US to not always be navel gazing. So you can search to that last question by offense type, though laws don't use necessarily the same words of violent, nonviolent. Status offense is a term of art that would be used because status offenses are only things that can be, that are ultimately about juvenile populations. You can only engage in a status offense if you're under the age of 18. And it may then include a particular type of crime, such as a robbery, for example, or manslaughter or murder. So you could search in that way, but we will not be coding by this idea of violent, non-violent status offense. So we're really looking at the terms of art that are actually in the statutes themselves or in the court rules, et cetera, so that we're not making an interpretation about sort of what skews in these different ways. And every state also is different in terms of what they do as their classifications relative to, while there's some consistency, not all things are coded the same way in state statute and criminal law.
And did we answer the question about maybe a future opportunity to add a frequently asked questions or a fact sheet document to accompany the database as it grows?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is what we've been talking about as kind of phase 2 of this project, is to create more of those resources that help people kind of make sense of all of the laws that are in the database. So definitely recommend that you sign up for the November webinar that we're offering. And we will be adding additional resources to this site as well. If you sign up for the National Center on Restorative Justice newsletter on our website, then you'll be able to see as soon as those new resources are released. But know that that type of additional information and resources in development.
All right. That was a rapid fire Q&A. Thank you both so much. Thank you again for the context and the demonstration of the database. I'm sure folks will find it helpful, have already begun to use it and find it very useful in their work. So Talia, you mentioned, thank you again for plugging that. I would be remiss if I didn't plug it again, what I consider more of an in-depth, like part 2 of the conversation that we're going to be having on November 20th. We'll be having a webinar that focuses on those key components for establishing legal frameworks, supporting restorative justice implementation in a criminal legal context. So more about legislation and policy on November 20th. And then next month, folks, we're back to our regional focus, and we're going to hear from RJ practitioners out in the Midwest. So that's happening Wednesday, September 25th. Is there anything else left to be said? Talia and Lindsay, thank you again for taking the time to roll this out.
Yeah, no, again, my hope is this is a useful tool for people. That's its intent, right? We need transparency, we need accessibility, especially as it comes to law. I feel very strongly and committed to that. And so it's why I've worked on it. It's why I think it's important. And I hope, right, that this 1.0 version is of service to the broader set of stakeholders and communities that are working on and interested in restorative justice at all of these different intersecting ways.
Fantastic.
Yeah, just to add my thanks to everyone for joining today. We'd love to hear from you, how you're using this resource, and stay tuned for phase 2 and additional related resources coming out soon.
I put my email in the chat. If anybody else, wants to, it's my UC Law email, but feel free to reach out or send me a note in my capacity as co-chair of the ABA committee.
Thank you all. Take care.
Take care.